All right, good day, Dad. Today is Wednesday, July 3rd, one day before July 4th. Um, what do you want to talk about? I'll leave it open for you. What do we want to
Um,
dive into?
okay, I thought we'd talk about the French elections for just a little bit. I think they're it's quite a fascinating topic. There are two rounds, right? And we're between the two rounds. The first round was already held. If you remember, I think it was back about a month ago. This has all happened in quick succession. The elections, the Europe-wide elections, were held for the European Parliament, which is basically a powerless organization, but it is a chance to kind of conduct an opinion poll to see what the hoi polloi are thinking, right?
The
And
what?
it was the hoi polloi. That's like the Lao Bai Xing, the people, the masses,
Eh,
the
vo-
unwashed masses.
Hopaloi? What's
Yeah,
that
hoi
from?
polloi. That's actually it just means the people, and it's from Greek, ancient Greek.
Okay, I have no
Okay,
idea.
all right. But anyway, so it came as a shock. I don't think it really changed anything in Europe because again, the European Parliament really doesn't have any power. But the certain in general anti-establishment parties did very well in both Germany and in France. And in France, we're talking about the National Rally, right, which is Marine Le Pen's party. It got better than 30% of the vote, and Macron's party did very poorly. And then Macron, for some reason, everybody's trying to figure it out, called a snap election for for the National Assembly. That's the lower house, of Parliament in France. And so we already had the first round. There are two rounds. The way it goes is the first one, anybody can participate. And if any candidate gets better than 50% of the vote, that candidate becomes a representative for that district. Okay. So the end result was that the National Rally, Marine Le Pen's party, got 33% of the vote, a little better than 33%. There was an alliance of leftist parties, a Communist Party, a Socialist Party, another Socialist Party, and the Greens that got 28% of the vote. Now, I think that's a real kind of a hodgepodge. It's a lot of those leftist parties actually have very different views on things, including Ukraine. But they decided to get together, mainly because they wanted to fight the great boogeyman of the National Rally and Marine Le Pen. And then Macron's party got just 20% of them. Now there are a lot of shrieks, and everybody is saying, including the leftists, is saying that our number one priority. This is what happens again and again in France. There's been the eternal specter of the National Rally, actually, and its predecessor, which was the National Front. Going back and ever since like 2000 and earlier, whenever it looks like they're going to gain power, and I think maybe the first time was early 2000s. It was back then. It was Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen. The National Front did unusually well in an election, and then so there was immediately panic and hysteria, among the establishment, and they just said, they built these alliances, anything to prevent him and his party from gaining power. And so they've done that again, and they did it again a few years ago, and they're trying to do that right now. And it's not clear if they're going to succeed this time. I guess one
Well,
thing. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, well, why are they so afraid of Marine Le Pen's party? Is she equivalent to like a Trump-like character? What's so scary
No,
about Marine
she
Le Pen?
she is not. She does not have the personality of anything like a Trump character. She's not. She comes across as being a rather reasonable person, and in general, it's hard to say. What is it that causes all the hysteria? Really, there's like on Ukraine and relations with Russia. She tends to kind of Yeah, she criticizes Russia and supports Ukraine, but says we should not get involved. We should try to find ways to negotiate with Russia, maintain relations with them and trade with them, which just seems to me like is as moderate a position as you could choose, and very reasonable. And I don't know why that would cause hysteria. I think the main thing is the question of immigration. And actually, the National Rally's position, it seems to me, is again very moderate. It's not that they're demanding that like non-French or people that are not of French ancestry should be deported. Nothing like that, right? They want to restrict immigration. It actually seems kind of milquetoast, kind of rather weak. I mean, again, but there is this tremendous hysteria that's been built up over the last few decades within the establishment center left against any sort of immigration restrictions, and this is actually very. It contradicts, what the left, the old left, advocated, both here in the United States and in Europe. For example, back in the just 2-3 decades ago, the communists in France were solidly opposed to immigration. And for obvious reason, they're it used to be what the left was all about is they were the party of the workers, right? And they wanted to protect their workers, and they saw, unrestricted mass immigration as a weapon that, the bosses were using to depress wages and to undermine unions and so forth. And that, again, that's the way, American Democrats, leftists thought. Some very well-known personalities, including people considered to be on the radical left, like Cesar Chavez, obviously of Mexican ancestry. He opposed, unrestricted immigration because, again, he saw that as harming his own people who were there, and he saw it again as an instrument of the capitalist class. And it's, truth be told, it's like one of the major proponents of unrestricted immigration in the U.S. is, within the media, is like the Wall Street Journal. Big business loves, mass immigration. It means lower wages. It means cheap labor, an unlimited supply. And
more people to sell to, right?
Yeah.
More
So,
population.
Right. So it's all very odd in a way. I think if you went back just a few decades and, you started to describe, let's say, Marine Le Pen and the positions that her party has staked out, and you would say, oh, that's the leftist party, and indeed, opinion polls show that she does, her party does very well among workers. It's the one that's favored by workers and by young people too. So, I mean, what is the left now? If they're losing the workers and they're using young people, what are they? And then what is it? You had Mélenchon, he is leader of this leftist coalition in France. Again, he's shrieking, we got to do anything. So it's just like to support Macron, Macron and his people who are, the epitome of what the left used to hate, right? They're the pro-war party. They're the, they're all about globalism and capitalism, right? But he's willing to make an alliance with them. He's willing to get their people elected in different districts, just to prevent Le Pen's party from coming to power. I find myself looking at it as just like in the U.S., we have a lot of bizarre behavior on the part of the establishment, and we can attribute that to TDS, Trump derangement syndrome. There seems to be kind of a Le Pen derangement syndrome in France too.
So is the main thing immigration for Le Pen? I mean, obviously the Russia-Ukraine war as well, that she's saying not get involved. Are those the two biggest issues that has propelled her to the forefront? Well,
I think yes, I think that's true. I mean, it's in general,
and when she says immigration restrictions, what does that mean exactly? She just wants to have some type of
right, like ending
a policy,
ending chain, immigration, just reducing in general the flow, not actually cutting it off entirely or anything. It's actually pretty moderate. Her father was much more hardline than she was. And so it was easier to paint him as a crypto fascist or whatever. And, he said a few things like, well, I think once he said the Holocaust was just a footnote to World War II, and that caused a lot of shrieks. And, that seemed to be proof that he was actually a crypto Nazi or something. And I think that's silly, but she doesn't even provide him with that kind of ammunition. She's...
Is the just sort of the demographics of Europe right now, is it largely just a result of open borders? Is it similar like what we have experiencing right now in the U.S., where people can just walk into France if they take a boat from Tunisia or something like this, or Algeria, and then they just end up in France, and then they're citizens? Is that how, or not citizens,
Yeah.
but they're just living there and they can't be deported? Is that the
It
situation?
seems to be, yeah. I mean, I think it's very, very difficult, and that the immigration began, I think, mostly from Algeria, where they call the Maghreb, that part of like northern Africa, after the colonial, the war that ended the French colony there. But since it's expanded, there still is a lot of immigration, and now you have a lot of second and third generation Algerians living in France, and you have Africans. You have people that got across the Mediterranean on a boat, or entered some other part of Europe and then got to France because there was a better deal for them in France. Quite a few go on to England. Just in general, it's it's sort of like there are laws on the books, but they're not very strictly enforced. There's a very powerful faction within all these countries that is actually believes that there should be no restrictions on immigration. It's just like what you see the slogan, like every human being is legal or something. And again, this is a very much a newfangled thing. You can, look, I know reasonable people can disagree on it, but it's not what the left was all about at one time. The left was about protecting, the workers that they represented, and they've ceased to do that. I mean, it's just clear as day. And so what has the left become? It's, I think it's become some kind of unholy alliance of supporters of American hegemony, and that's manifested in the policy vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. Globalism, which would be unrestricted trade in capital flows, but also unrestricted flows of people, all these things, and identity and woke politics, that all these things are combined. And it's something that, it's definitely a minority of people actually are buy the whole package, but these are the people that have the power. Like in France, again, you say workers are against that, kind of like average rural French people are against it. Now you get the immigrants and the children and grandchildren of these immigrants on the side of the left, but they don't, they obviously don't support the woke stuff or whatever. It's just a marriage of convenience, and I guess they're both kind of looking as that they can use the other. The establishment's using them really as a battering ram against Le Pen and her people. As a way to break down French identity. But then those people are thinking, well, okay, we're going to, we want to bring in more of our people because eventually we want to have a society that's built in our own, according to our own program, which, is for a lot of them a Muslim view of the world.
Well, why do you think that this is just a Western type of ideology, this idea of open borders, and illegal immigration is just okay? It's such a crazy idea, especially for, someone like me that's spent over 10 years living in Asia. You can't just walk into a country. That's absurd. You can't just walk into Japan and live there, or walk into China or Korea. The visa process is something that all of us expats have to go through, and we always bitch and moan about it, but it's just, we understand. And just the idea that you could just walk into America and it's okay, and they'll take care of you, or into Europe is such a strange foreign concept for any other nation. And if you've been outside of the West, you will understand that immediately if you live in another country.
Well, even if you go to Mexico, I mean, we of course have many Mexicans in America. And but Mexico itself has very strict immigration policies. So if you're in Guatemala and you want to go to Mexico, no way. But
This is my
if you're in
theory.
Guatemala, you pass through Mexico to make it to the U.S. and there you're welcome.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah, it's really crazy. Maybe this is my theory: is that the Western countries have kind of this post colonialism guilt, and they're using this as to sort of atone for their sins of their past, because this is always talked about, like,
Yeah.
oh, how evil
Right.
the white European powers were and what they did to the world. And maybe that's why they're like, this idea it takes hold in Western Europe, because the idea of having a French pride or German pride, they've been taught to be ashamed of
Yeah.
their nationalism. So
Right.
we can't celebrate our own identity. We need to atone for the atrocities that we committed in the past, and importing other people might be a way to kind of cope
Yeah,
with
no,
that.
well,
I don't know.
I mean, Angela Merkel made that explicit. If you remember when there was that 2 million immigrants that just poured into Germany, how many years ago? Was it 10 years ago? Something like that. There was that great refugee crisis, and there was, well, that's what she said. This is something that will atone for her past. I mean, she didn't use exactly those words, but there were words to that effect. You know, very
Yeah.
much so. I'm not twisting her meaning. She
did you
outright
think-
said that.
Do you think that this is something that just organically came out through all of Western Europe because of their colonial past, or do you think that this was something that was fueled a bit by, the sort of leftist ideology, or something that sprung out of the U.S.? Because a lot of the immigrants that flooded into Europe are really the results of U.S. intervention in these wars, and
Right.
they're having to deal with the problem, and they have to say, "Oh, I was so sorry that we had colonies in Africa and the Middle East or
Right.
whatever." But I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly a lot of the immigration, and particularly, that flows into Europe, is fueled by conflicts that you can attribute, at least in part, to Western policies. That was true of Syria, and of Libya quite clearly. I don't think that was the intended consequence, but that has become the actual consequence of those policies. That's just a very difficult question to answer. It's kind of a mystical question. Why is it that we have this? And there are all kinds of explanations that are put out there, and they're probably, these various explanations contribute something to our understanding of it. And one is that it's sort of I would say, a post-Christian sensibility and ideology. It's just that there's Christians speak of original sin and the fallen nature of man, and but it had a theological sense that wasn't applied in the form that we're seeing right now. But it's just that we're living in a post-Christian world where certain Christian ideas have become greatly distorted, corrupted, and it's part of this new religion of where we have these sins, and that we have to seek redemption, not through prayer and fasting and repentance, but through a political kind of repentance, right, by bringing in immigrants. And that's how we wash away our sins. Again, this is the kind of language that you see people using. Now, there's also let's say you could call it the anti-Semitic theory, which is put forward by people like Kevin. Oh gosh, how can I forget his name right now?
Kevin Bacon.
No.
No.
Right. It'll come to me. I'm terrible with names. They're always slipping my mind. But it's just that Jews as a group see it in their interest to break down the identity, the coherence, the cohesiveness of European societies, especially white Christian European society. They see this as their enemy. They blame that for the persecutions that they suffered, in the past, and the most extreme form, of course, being under Hitler. And so they have a policy of supporting mass immigration and racial diversity, cultural diversity within these countries to break down the core identity. And they say, well, that way we're safer. There'll never be a Hitler in the future if we can do that.
Really? Do you think that's a conscious thought that a lot of powerful Jews?
I don't think it's at all ridiculous. I think there's a lot to it. I don't think you can attribute everything to it. But like I was saying, like each one of these theories, I think, contributes something. And I think it's a little bit harder to push that in Europe because there just aren't very many Jews. Now there are in France, it's a very small segment of the population, but it is quite influential. In the U.S., it's a larger segment and it's very, very influential. And I think you can make that argument pretty well there. And I was struck because I think I told you, I grew up, there were a lot of my classmates and friends and so forth were Jewish. And I always, assumed that all Jews were, leftist political activists in favor of diversity. That's what you would find. And then when I went to Israel, about 13 years ago, I was just assuming that that's the kind of society I would find and say, no, actually the people that are in favor of diversity in Israel, are very hard to find. They're like hen's teeth. They just barely exist. I mean, when you get to Israel, it's all about homogeneity, and about cultural cohesiveness. Extreme nationalism is, which we're seeing manifested right now. But so often you have the same people. I mean, people like Schumer, the senator from New York, advocating again always for diversity and for a weakening of the core identity here in the U.S., but at the same time favoring extreme nationalism within Israel. And so I think there is something to that. I mean, and it's just like, okay, well, they're only 2% of the population, but this is a very influential 2% of the population. And it really has, without a doubt, I think.
But why? Why would they? Do they feel like it would make Jews safer in their own country if we break down the cultural idea, Christian cultural identity?
Yeah.
I mean,
well, I think some conservative Jews have come out and said that this is just crazy. And actually, well, especially since it seems, that like the number one philo-Semites in our country are now conservative Christians of a certain type, right? Mm-hmm. And so some Jews have come out and said this, but this is this is set in motion. You go back to the 60s and 70s. That's just not the way that Jews looked at it when a lot of these policies were established, like when the immigration was reformed in the 60s. I mean, I think there are a lot of Jews that may have done, I think it's probably not so rational, it's just that it's just this sort of this kind of visceral fear or hatred of white Christianity among Jews of a certain stripe, white Christians, and seeing them as being, the eternal oppressor, and just looking for any ways to kind of to knock them off their pedestal. I think that's quite clear. I mean, if you just now we may be coming to a different point in history, but for the last few decades, that was true. I don't think it's very rational, but it's just sort of a lot of things in politics are not rational.
Yeah, so it's hard to. I mean, I've met Jews in college, been friends with some. I've met Israelis and things like this. It just when I think about Ben Shapiro is a conservative Jew, right? Obviously very Zionist, but I don't think he's someone that wants open borders. So
right.
Maybe it's an old thing.
Again, I say that we're coming to maybe a different stage in the history. But as up until now, we are getting more conservatives, and like the alliance between Israel, the Netanyahu is looking more to the right side of the political spectrum. That used not to be true. That used to really be Jews were almost overwhelmingly, and they still are, largely leftist, but they used to be overwhelmingly leftist, and so it was now we have a different kind of political landscape, and I think that this is beginning to shift. But these policies were set in motion a long time ago. Like in the U.S., the immigration policy was really set in the 1960s.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about why this is, a Western phenomenon. I mean,
yeah. Again, I don't want to. I don't want to, put it all on the Jews or whatever. I think that's part of it. It's just, especially in the United States, I think it's hard to say that it isn't. But there is also something that's internal within, I think, Christian culture, post-Christian culture, that's particularly susceptible to that. But you're right. When you get outside of the West, you just don't find it, and people don't even know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I like to think of, think about Japan, for example. That was an imperial country that took huge swaths of land and committed horrific atrocities in China, the rape of Nanjing and all these experiments. They're not like, oh, we're really sorry for that. Chinese people can just come into China whenever they want and live here. It's not easy to get into Japan. Immigration in Japan is difficult,
Right. Well, they're very careful to let people come in on, for
visit, right?
Tourist visa, no problem. On work visas, they're given 5 years and then they got to leave the country, and that's that. Yeah, no, it's just true. It's true in African countries and so forth. You can't just, they all police their borders and have immigration policies and, are jealously protect the territory that they have.
So do you think that, there's this force maybe in the United States, post-Christian culture combined with, atoning for the sins of our past, plus the Jews pushing for more diversity and open borders to kind of break down the fabric of Christian identity, and then that was kind of whatever the U.S. does, it kind of exports it to Europe, and the rest of Europe just kind of followed along with the new order.
Right, right. I think you could always find that in Europe. Not all European countries there was that tendency, but I think. Right, a lot of this has now been, like, for example, the extreme forms of woke culture, that's actually an export from the U.S. into Europe. And now that Europe is losing its identity, it's really becoming increasingly a vassal of the United States, is being colonized by us both, politically, militarily, but also culturally.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just the European Union as a project itself, I think, is just kind of an extension of the sort of globalist, no borders type of policy. So
there was a hope actually among people like Alexander Dugin, which we can talk about later. Going back to 2000, when the European Union was kind of just getting off the ground, that it could become a vehicle for a European identity vis-a-vis the American identity. But that's failed to materialize. It's become an instrument of American domination.
Yeah, I was, I spent a lot of time in Europe, lived there for almost 2 years. And, I was kind of excited about the whole EU project and the Euro. I was like, this is cool. You can just travel around. I really liked it. But now that I'm a bit older, I'm seeing some of the problems associated with that. You do lose your identity. Just even small things like the currency. I like when I go to Norway. Yeah, and then I have my kroners, and there's its own sets of identity. It's not part of the EU. Yeah. I know other countries like Denmark and Sweden also aren't using the euro, but they're part of the EU bloc.
Yeah, it seems minor, but I think it does reflect something deeper. Yeah, and it just hasn't turned out the way that I think a lot of people thought. I mean, the establishment likes it. But, one thing is that these people are, the various peoples of Europe are discovering is that they're losing their respective sovereignties and their rights. They're surrendering rights to this unaccountable elite in Brussels. And it's now real hard to get it back, to get these rights back.
Well, but what we're seeing in the election in France with Marine Le Pen is just across Europe, there's sort of a real pushback now. It's saying that's rejecting this sort of globalist project is what it seems like part of what they're saying. Obviously, with the
I
Russia
think it was
Ukraine
actually
thing,
earlier, like an earlier incarnation of the National Rally, or certainly the National Front. They were explicitly anti-EU, and I think they've backed off of that. But I think it's fair to say that there's at least a suspicion of the EU. And, within the National Front, not the National Front, it's now the National Rally, what used to be the National Front.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, maybe we can go back to, we kind of went off on some tangents. So Marine Le Pen, she's looking like she's going to, what is she going to be president? What does this mean?
Okay,
I don't
well,
understand what's happening.
it's not a presidential election. It's an election for the National Assembly. Okay, so we had the first round, and only a few representatives were actually elected in this first round because you have to have over 50%. And I think in the case of there were maybe 29 from the National Rally, and then there were 20 perhaps from that leftist alliance, and that was basically it. There might have been just one, if even that, for Macron's party. Now, what happens is in the second round, it's just like every candidate that had less than 12.5% of the vote, which is say 1/8 of the total, is struck from the list, and so you have the remaining candidates, those that had 12.5% or higher. So typically there's something like 3 candidates left. And now, so that's okay. That's part of what happens, what changes. But then also in this week, between the two rounds, or the parties can get together and negotiate. And so now you have a lot of, again, you have this National Rally coalition being put together. They're saying anything but. Okay, well, let's say in this district, if we agree to remove our candidate, and that'll give your candidate, let's say Macron's party, a chance to win. Okay, in this one, Macron's party agrees to remove their candidate from the rolls, and now it's the leftist candidate. Because Macron will tell all his supporters to vote for the leftist candidate, and vice versa, and maybe by doing this they can actually win a majority of districts. Now, right now, there's a possibility that some of one thing is actually, they can tell their voters what to do, but they can't control them. So there may be some leftist voters who actually say, "Hey, I'm going to vote for Le Pen because I don't care what you guys say. I think, actually because for me it's about workers." Interesting. Like one of the places where Le Pen's party won was actually in a district that had voted communist for like the last 50 years, and so it been actually flipped here. So you could see some of that happening. And then there is, at least initially, the Republican Party, which is kind of a respectable, mainstream, right-leaning party. Actually, the head of that party said that he supported Le Pen and said that he would, when it came to the second round, he would urge his voters to go with her. And that created some kind of rebellion within his party, and then I think he was even barricaded in his office for a while, and there was a lot of drama, and who knows what's going to happen. So again, there is a lot of all these efforts are being made to deny Le Pen and her party a majority in the National Assembly, but it's not clear that it's going to succeed. It looks to me sort of like 50-50. I think partly it's sort of like Chicken Little saying the sky is falling, the sky is falling. It's been happening for 20 years, and people are probably just don't really care anymore, stop fearing it, and I know a lot of them just have such a hatred for the establishment that they're just not going to listen, and they're going to vote for it. But we don't know how many. This maneuvering is going to on the part of the leftists and Macron, is certainly going to eat into her support, but it's going to make it more difficult for her to get 50%, get a majority in the parliament. But she might pull it out. We'll see.
Well, why is there so much hysteria on the left whenever a right nationalist candidate it starts to pull well or do well? We're talking, with Trump or with Marine Le Pen. Like they just freak out, and they just start immediately saying that Trump is going to start shooting people on the street when he gets elected, dictator for a day, that all of our rights are going to be gone. The same thing with Le Pen; it's just going to be a bloodbath. And instead of actually trying to provide a better candidate from their own side and addressing the issues that are plaguing their country, they constantly work on this this hysteria of what would happen, how terrible it would be if the right gets elected, and instead of actually debating the issues or presenting something good. Why is there that just reflexive kind of like Trump derangement syndrome. It's
Right.
a real thing.
Yeah.
It's a real thing.
Right.
People just
Well, I
can't.
think, yeah. Well, I think it's just we saw it. We saw the consequences of Trump derangement syndrome in that debate. Again, we talked about this at some length, but I think it bears some repeating. It's just that for anybody who was outside of that bubble, who wasn't part of that establishment, it was just a well-known fact that this guy was gone, that he was senile and he was well past his due date, right? We'd all seen the clips, but this is something that, but if you were a reader, a consumer of, the New York Times and the Washington Post and MSNBC, you would heard that people are making these criticisms, but they're bad people, and it's all fake news, and please look the other way. All sensible people know that this can't be true. And then all of a sudden, oh my God, it became so obvious that they just started, we had the hysteria that's still ongoing, right? And it's clear, I mean, that they're, these people really have lost their connection to reality in some very important ways. It's just that they are kind of, in this insulated bubble. And they've convinced themselves that there's boogeymen out there, and I guess this is maybe the way to look at it. It's because they've developed this paranoia, this excessive fear of various kinds of positions. Any kind of like criticism of immigration or whatever. Everything is just like, well, that's the road to Auschwitz. Everything is the road to Auschwitz for them. It's just like, we can't compromise this, or, maybe we should negotiate with the Russians. Well, that's negotiating with Hitler, right? They, by demonizing all their opponents, they become victims of this paranoia, and it just means that they can't think clearly. So, there was, that paranoia prevented them from seeing what was right in front of them, namely that their candidate, the one that they chose, was this senile
dementia. It's not even senile.
Right. Yeah. It's beyond senile. He just, who just seems to be barely on the side of the grave. This is, so yeah, this is what happens when you demonize all your opponents. This is what happens. You descend into paranoia, and then you can't actually engage with reality. You start to define like what are acceptable opinions. That definition becomes increasingly narrow, and your rhetoric becomes increasingly strident. Your vision becomes increasingly narrow too, and
right.
And
well,
then
also,
go ahead.
Also, kind of what we were talking about earlier, how, the left has kind of lost a cultural or national identity, and instead it's been replaced with, with the leftist political ideology. That's it. So that's their identity. And so if the other candidate is somebody that's supposed to be destroying who you are as a person, your identity, your whole thing, because you don't have something deeper to kind of ground you, maybe.
Yeah.
That you've replaced, your faith or your patriotism, your nationalism, your family or whatever with the ideas of diversity and globalism and inclusion. And then somebody's coming in saying like, maybe we should not go complete open borders. Like, oh my God, that's attacking everything that I stand for and I'm at the core. And so it creates this sort of visceral reaction.
Right. It's a part of it, like a sense of, this is what makes me a good person, right? Is that I have these ideas and I have these positions, and it becomes very, very fragile. It's not part of the give and take or, the hustle and bustle of reality, but this is my core identity, and you do not touch it, right?
Right.
Don't dare touch it.
I can understand a bit because, it's rooted in compassion. A lot of these people are wanting to be good people. They want to help people. They want to help people that are disenfranchised, people that are from poorer countries, and that's admirable. But it's too short-sighted. I feel like the problem is like we forget that if you really want to make a change and help people, you need to start, well, first with your own life, with your own yourself, clean up your room, take care of yourself. Help your friends, the people around you, expand. There's this sort of this idea, same thing with environmentalism, that just like, we just need to help the planet. We need to help the world. We need it without really thinking through what that means instead of just like, let's vote for these policies of open borders and
Uh-huh.
let's don't allow any
Right.
more pizza ovens in New York City or whatever it is,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Anyways, yeah.
No,
That's,
no, no. I think that's very true, and it's a very important point. I mean, a lot of these things do start off with the best of intentions, and and I think again, you don't want to assume that these are bad people or whatever. It's. I think actually it shows that actually that focus on compassion has helped them when it came to understanding what's happening in Israel. And then you have on the right, there's sometimes this reaction, like it's just like, I don't even want to hear about compassion and like whatever, because you just feel like it's just part of some sort of con game, and that can make you very cynical and actually can end up meaning that, yeah, you overlook a genocide. So let's be honest about that. But yeah,
right.
let's say in the case of immigration, I think I understand that actually, I sort of, my natural instincts are sort of kind of are favorable towards immigration because, I have an interest in languages and different cultures, and I like exotic foods and whatever. And but I can't just take my own, sort of personal preferences and just insist that that has to be national policy. There are economic consequences, and the economic consequences hit people often at the bottom rung of the economic ladder the hardest. And you got to look at that, And again, the old leftists understood that. And then these new leftists just refuse to look at that. And they just want to demonize those people at the bottom rungs and saying, because they're critical. And then, these are people who, often they see their neighborhoods just disintegrating, often under these economic pressures, but then also because of an influx of people who speak a language they can't understand. And well, for wealthier people and more mobile people, you can just go live where you want and then go, drive over and eat at that restaurant or go to that neighborhood briefly. And isn't it, wonderful and exotic? But if you're poor, you just see it as the end of the way of your life. This is where you're rooted and your neighborhood is being destroyed, and you get angry, and then people point at you and say you're a hater, and there's just no real attempt to look at the whole picture and to actually develop some empathy for the which, like you say, you really should start again with your own people, your own nation. There is something that's false about kind of insisting on loving people on the other side of the world, right? And at the detriment of your own people.
Right. Yeah, when you're saying you have kind of a natural inclination to be pro-immigration because you like languages and other cultures, and I just realized, yeah, that's actually very true with me as well. I was just talking with my wife yesterday, just saying like, we both of us are much more comfortable talking to non-white Americans or just in the United States, just because we've both been living as expats for so long. I spent basically my whole adult life outside of America. And so I just have this I'm just more comfortable speaking to people that are not American, it's, and so, but I have this, the same idea though. Like I love diversity. I love interacting with people of different cultures, but I also fully understand the need of having your borders, because that's how you get to create your own culture and identity,
right.
and people can enjoy it.
Right.
Now we don't have it. We can't celebrate it. Like I love, going to Japan and it's Japanese. It's really
Right.
different, and
Right.
it's fun.
You'd be
to see
disappointed
how
if you got
weird
there and it
is.
wasn't Japanese. Like, you didn't. But now, like, you go
Right.
to London and it doesn't seem very British anymore. And I love the
Right.
old Brit. I'd like to see people in bowler hats and so on and so forth. And it's just it's
Yeah.
really it's becoming difficult to find.
Right. You get, and people obviously like it as well, because you just see, just in terms of TV shows and movies, people love that old aristocrat British stuff. Like
sure.
it's cool. That's
Yeah.
old England.
Yeah,
That's
it would be a shame for that to
it's
go.
true.
And unfortunately, you have a lot of people who just seem to within Britain that seem to be intent on tearing it all down, and then we will have
Yeah.
lost something.
Well, do you think that, it's gotten so far to the point in a lot of Europe where, I don't think you can maybe preserve the French identity and the British identity to some extent and have a different demographic makeup, like if somebody wants to immigrate to France, from wherever, great. But the idea is that I think you need to adopt what being French is. You need to
Yeah.
assimilate into French culture. You
Right.
need to learn
Well,
how to
that
speak
seems
the
like common
language. You need
sense, right?
to, right, right. You can't just show up and be like, I'm going to be my own little thing here and never integrate, assimilate into the society. And I think that's the problem. And I think
Right.
everybody understands and respects that. It's actually, it's cool when I go to France and, I have a good, actually a guy from, a tiny little French Guiana. But he lives in Paris now, and yeah, a black guy. But I always find it fun going to France and hanging out with him and his black friends because they're all black, but they all speak French, And as an American, you're used to thinking what black people sound like, what they look like. So
Yeah.
that's cool, I like that actually when I go to
Uh-huh.
France and I hang out with these guys. But they've assimilated and they're French. They identify as French.
Right.
Yeah, do you think there's a way that we can that Europe can? Is this kind of what Marine Le Pen and what's happening here? Is this move to preserve French culture, French
Right.
identity, and we're seeing waves of this in other European countries?
Yeah. No, there clearly is a growing, they call it, a rising populist tide in Europe. You're seeing it in Germany and Italy, France. One place where where it is the establishment, of course, is in Hungary. And Viktor Orban, a very popular government, by the way. It's just that they do very well in the elections because they really are reflecting the will of the people. The problem with Viktor Orban is that he's within the European Union, and there is this constant pressure. I mean, I think there was recently, I can't remember, but, high-ranking EU officials saying that we just need to destroy this guy. This kind of language is being used. They have a lot of different, ways to pressure Hungary and other dissident countries, to conform. But yeah, it remains to be seen. I mean, that's partly why the French elections is why they are so interesting, and I think deserve our attention. Because if indeed National Rally does achieve a majority, and that may lead to presidential elections, it may be that Macron will decide that he can't run the country, because the French have an interesting system. They have like a lot of countries, a president and a prime minister, but Macron is the president, but the prime minister actually has a lot of power. I mean, it's in certain countries like Israel, the prime minister is basically ceremonial, and the president has all the executive power. But that's not true in France. The president has more power, but the prime minister has considerable power. And if the National Rally wins the election and gets a majority in parliament, then at least according to custom, according to kind of what the accepted procedure, I guess it's not legally required, but the accepted procedure is that the head of the majority party in parliament should become the prime minister. And that wouldn't be Le Pen herself. I think that's Jordan, I forget his name is, but he would become, he is the leader of the National Rally, and he would become prime minister. And Macron might just decide that forget this, this isn't going to work, and he might just resign and call for presidential elections, and then Le Pen could become president. That could happen. We'll see. But anyway, just saying, if they get a majority and she becomes president, then that could be a turning point for Europe, or it could be a great disappointment for people who are looking for real reform in foreign policy and immigration policy. Because again, it's just like, like with Trump, I think there's more reason to be hopeful about Le Pen and her party, partly because the leaders are experienced politicians, who understand how government works, they're more disciplined, than the very erratic Trump, and they have a party they've built up over the decades, that's behind them on these issues, and so there is a real chance that if they do take power, they could, change the course of the country. We'll see. But then again, there's always a chance that they get co-opted. They get, that they sell out when they gain. We've seen that with politicians all around the world.
Right.
It may just do nothing, but we'll see. There's a chance. I think there's a real chance, and it certainly it deserves our attention.
Okay. Is the hysteria against Le Pen anywhere near as to Trump that here in the United States? The amount of
I believe
fear and
right.
It's similar.
Yeah, I think it is similar. It may be. I think it might be starting to wear thin because they've been doing this for decades now. But yeah, I just saw, what was it? It was I think Henri Bernard Lévy is kind of the Kagan, the Mr. Neocon of France, and he was saying that Le Pen and some of these leftists, they're basically all on Putin's payroll, and going on and on about it. I mean, the whole thing's so absurd, but it's just talking like so many people talk in our country too.
Well, if there's as much hysteria against Le Pen as there is, hysteria here in the United States against Trump, do you think that if the national rally, if they take control, do you think that it would be peaceful? I mean, because that's what I worry about here in the United States, right, is that they like we've talked about just this hysteria on their identity, and that it's now under attack, and and that they have made Le Pen and Trump to be Hitler times 10, and he's going to be a dictator and destroy everyone's life, and it's going to be fascism on the street. So we got to take him out.
Well, I mean, I know. I actually follow Hillary Clinton on Twitter, and she talks like that. I mean, recently she's been saying things basically like, if you let Trump take over, it's curtains for democracy, and it's a fascist takeover. And you're getting a lot of language like that from
I see
people, Rachel Maddow and whatever.
Everybody. No, I'm seeing it really hard on Twitter from left, because they realize that the only thing we can do is, like, our choice is between Hitler or somebody that's senile. If you're choosing between Hitler and senile, you got to go senile, guys. What are you doing?
Right.
Yeah.
So well, I mean, if you really believe in this, then you can justify yourself some sort of extra constitutional takeover, right? I mean,
well, especially now with the Supreme Court ruling. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, because I don't fully understood, but I see that the left is going nuts with it, saying that the presidential immunity, that means that Trump could start sending SEAL Team 6, to assassinate his opponents and things like this. Is there anything really big here? But actually, my concern is that Biden will use this precedence, like, the Supreme Court ruled on this presidential immunity, so I can do more drastic measures, because the left has painted Trump to be such a boogeyman. We have to sacrifice everything. We have to give up our rights. We have to do whatever it is in an effort to preserve democracy and keep Hitler from coming to power here in the United States, because that's what it is, So that's what scares me. And so now, I don't know. I feel like the odds of civil war happening in the United States went up after that debate, and then after the Supreme Court ruling. That's just my opinion.
I don't know how much difference the Supreme Court ruling really will make. I guess in the short term, it's going to at least delay some of the cases, some of the the trials that he's potentially facing, and so it's probably to his advantage. It does what it essentially says is that presidents have immunity for official actions, and that the notion of what official is a little bit fuzzy, and. Yeah, I there's some danger in that. It's kind of regrettable, but I think it's also to be expected. I mean, I think it was really a kind of a reaction to the clear attempt to use the courts to come after him. The fact that the Democrats resorted to lawfare to go after Trump, and this is the Supreme Court reaction. It probably should never have happened. If they never did that, then there wouldn't be this need to somehow to protect presidents from that. And maybe an overreaction. I don't really understand the law well enough to comment on it.
Yeah. Yeah, overall, I don't like the idea of it because I feel like I'm not so much concerned about Trump. I'm actually a bit more concerned
Yeah,
about
well,
Biden.
that's true. It's important to also, this happens on both sides of the spectrum. You have this victory that seems great for your side, and in the short run, it probably is. But you always forget that whatever, like the Supreme Court decides, it can end up being used by the other side in the future. And so that's where we are.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a side. I think that needs to be clear. I don't, I don't like either of these guys. I just don't like this. Our whole government has just gotten so gross and bloated and so much in debt. It's like I just
Yeah.
want people to be able to live their lives in peace without having this constant bickering, and it's just politics in the U.S. is just it's disgusting.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I hate that I'm
Well,
getting pulled into it because I feel like I have to because I live in this country now.
right. There are
And I'm like,
consequences, right? Yeah. To
and
who
what,
gets elected.
say what you want about China, but one thing that I did like about China is that everybody, when you talk with people, you don't talk politics that much because you have a one-party system and everybody is just, and things are going fine in China. The economy's growing, people are getting more money, infrastructure is developing,
Yeah.
so people aren't really
Right.
too worried about it. So
Right.
you
The
have
one thing I
different
kind of-
conversations. It's
Yeah, actually, it kind of frees people up, and they don't because well, there aren't parties, so people aren't partisan, so they actually can
Right.
think more clearly. They may disagree with their government, and I've talked to Chinese who do, and others who support it, or they disagree with one aspect, whatever. But they can, I think, they can actually be much more rational. In this hyper-partisan atmosphere, you just get a lot of crazies on both sides. People just can't think straight, and that's what we saw. In the debate and after the debate, the reaction to it. It just
right. It just makes conversation. Everything has become divided. Everything is partisan now. I think that was made clear with, for example, with COVID. Like that just became such a partisan
Yeah,
thing. And
right.
Me living in China, it just wasn't. Nobody really talked about. Nobody was asking about whether you're vaccinated or
Yeah,
cared if you
right. It
wore a
became a
mask or
political
didn't.
statement. It just shouldn't be,
Yeah,
Right.
it
I mean,
just-
it's
it
a
was
health
never a
decision
thing.
between you and your doctor. But it became a political position one way or the other. And yeah,
Right. So it was mind blowing for me in China, because nobody really talked about it. Nobody got upset if you didn't wear a mask or whatever. There were certain rules that people had to follow, like on the metro, you had to wear a mask, but there was no real push. People asking if you've been vaccinated. Nobody's giving you dirty looks if you're not wearing a mask. Like
Right.
it just wasn't a thing.
Yeah.
And it's so crazy that it was such a big thing here in America. Like, why did it become partisan? Like, why does everything in the U.S. and it makes it so hard for a country to move forward? If you just, whenever I meet someone in the grocery store, I'm like, can I have a conversation? Well, I don't know where you stand on this issue. Are you on the left? Or, like it just becomes everything. Like you're buying Pepsi. Oh, you must be it's just, it's out of control. How do we resolve that? It just seems like it's becoming more and more hyper-partisan
right.
because
and in
you
the
have
meantime, right. I mean, there's hyper-partisanship, but then nothing changes.
Right.
And
Right.
often the debates are about things that, the two sides seem to be, are at each other's throats, and yet the policies don't change.
Right.
Like we're looking at, our general focus is on geopolitics. It probably won't change. There's a chance it might if Trump is elected, but there's
With
a very
Ukraine,
good
yeah.
chance. I think much better than 50% chance that nothing will change if he becomes president. Everything will be the same. And then, so what was all that,
Right.
frothing at the mouth and hysteria about in the end?
Right. It's this hysteria essentially this illusion of democracy that we have this choice without really the truth is that there is an establishment, there is a deep state that runs things and rules us and the world the way it wants to rule it. And we're given these two choices that are like Pepsi and Coke, but you take away the labels, they're the exact same thing. You're not going to pass the taste test once you remove it. So I just wish more people will wake up to that. Like, look, this is why we at each other's throats when we're getting the same thing either way. It's. I mean, maybe it's a little bit different now because it's just so on display with Biden. It's just I don't know, but.
Right.
But I mean, like, come on, Bush and Obama or whatever. It's like, okay, whatever. It's Pepsi. Coke for me.
there are some changes. I have to admit, It does have consequences, but they're just not nearly as great as what people make them out to be.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of foreign policy, it doesn't seem to matter
Especially
at
foreign
all.
policy, it just doesn't seem to change.
Right. People get worked up about these domestic issues, but the reality is like, these things to me, it's like these are kind of more personal issues. They don't really affect my day-to-day life too much. Although maybe actually I'll take that back a little bit. I
Yeah.
think some of these leftist things have seeped into society and
Into schools and so forth, right?
into schools. Just kind of just breaking things down in general.
Right.
I think I noticed it starkly because I was living in China for 10 years, so I left UT right after I graduated university, and then China for over 10 years. I come back and it's a different place. And I could see it because I was gone for that time. I think a lot of people didn't notice it, but just in terms of just society, like the drug use, homelessness, like trans stuff, like
Right.
none of this was a thing.
Right.
And now it's everywhere, and,
Right.
and I can see it and I can feel it, and of course inflation. I remember when I left, I could still get a beer for $1 at during happy hour. Like those days are long, long gone. So,
Right.
yeah. So, well,
Yeah. No, there are, I certainly am not of the opinion. I sometimes hear people who are, certainly allies of mine, and when it comes to geopolitics, saying, this culture stuff, that's just all a bunch of nonsense. I certainly don't think it. It's actually very, very important. But
I
it's
take
just
it
not,
back. I agree.
Yeah, actually, in some ways, you can say it's the most important. It's about who we are, but I guess what I would say is just like there's not. It's hard to actually make a clear connection between it and politics. Often, this, one side might use the discontent that a lot of us feel about, let's say, the cultural madness, in this case, often the Republicans, but when they take power, they often don't do anything. Sometimes, you have to say they do. So it's not crystal clear. But I think in the end, I won't say that politics doesn't matter. Clearly it does. But it's probably not going to be solved by either party.
Right.
We're not going to find a savior for, what the ills that beset us in either party.
Right. Yeah. I mean, stuff like this, as a new parent, you just kind of realize that how important it is that the best form of governance is really your family, nuclear family. You need to start with that and teach your kids, because there's been, I think, a problem. This is also a problem with the institutions that have been created in the United States for so long, is that they built up a reputation. We were great. We loved what our country did in our schooling and the American pride, all this stuff. It's like, great. The U.S. is the best system. So it allowed a lot of people that were just kind of fell asleep at the wheel and abdicated their responsibilities to the government and these institutions to
the
take care of their
schools
kids,
and so forth, right?
And even for their own education information,
Right.
just like, I just listen to
Yeah.
what they say, and because we're the best country in the world and we've done so many great things.
Yeah.
And then we didn't realize that, hey, we took the wrong road 30 years ago, and now here we are.
Right.
And
Right.
now we need to reclaim
Yeah.
that responsibility. We can't advocate it anymore.
Yeah, that reminds me. I think it was, back in the Soviet days, sometimes you get, certainly there were refugees from the Soviet Union, defectors. And, obviously they were not supporters of the Soviet system. But some of them I remember reading this decades ago, about they were struck by the naivete of Americans. Because one thing like this, living under the Soviet system taught them is to read things critically, to be suspicious of government pronouncements and so forth, and, to learn to do your own research and so forth. And then they found that Americans were very naive. Now, it probably wasn't so deadly to be naive, 50 years ago, because our institutions, all in all, were pretty healthy. And certainly we were fed some lies, but, overall we got the truth. But now it's just not true. And fortunately, I think that naivete that those Soviet defectors noticed back then is coming to an end. That that a lot of people have become very cynical, very skeptical, and they should be.
Right. Well, I saw a poll that something like, I think it was 83% of Gen Zers, so young people in the United States, in a poll said that America is a dying empire run by bad men. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's more or less right. So they're woken up.
Right.
And you can just see just the amount of gaslighting that's been done by our media on
Right.
so many things, especially now with this Biden debate. Like you were
Uh-huh.
just a week before, there's Joe Scarborough saying he's sharp as a tack. Oh, they're running
Yeah.
circles around me. Joe's just, man, his
Yeah.
mind's just too fast. He's too good,
You're right.
telling us for so long. And then everyone's like, this is, you've been gaslighting us for so long. You've
Yeah.
just been,
Right.
now you're a sucker if you still believe in these institutions anymore.
Right.
It's like, and I, I understand that a lot, it takes a long time for some people to change their ideas because they've been brought up 60, 70 years listening to these institutions, and it's hard to let
Trusting
go.
in them, yeah. And some of them
Yeah,
just
but
can't. They'll
but
believe them
it's
to the end.
right. But you can see that the trend is changing. If that poll is just a sign that
Right.
that people no longer trust
Yeah.
their government, and
Yeah.
the older people that still do, well, slowly, maybe some will change their mind, but of course they will slowly die off, and the new cohort is coming in, and it's like what you're saying with the old Soviet Union, that naivete is gone. People are like, you believe that stuff? Like, what?
Yeah.
That you actually trust CNN? You trust, New
Yeah.
York Times? Really? Like, I didn't think anybody did that anymore.
Yeah,
And that's where we're moving.
Right. I'm surprised how many people still do, but yeah, they're increasingly becoming a minority.
Well, yes, the power of the
Right.
power of that institution, it has a lot of momentum. But
Yeah.
like we were saying, just I think what happened in this debate actually can't be understated.
Yeah.
It really blew things open. Like
Right.
oh my
well,
God,
I'm sure
we
that,
were just
yeah, I'm just
lied
saying
to.
around the world, people have to have been looking at clips of that and saying, "Oh, that's America." I think maybe I'll take down my American flag from. This is. I think
Yeah.
it's just another step down. From that summit. Of where America once was, the time when America was really
Yeah.
at the. At its peak. It's just another step down from that summit and down into the valley.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is like we should go America. I mean, screw the presidency. We're supposed to be a constitutional republic.
Uh-huh.
Let's get back to that. Let's get back to taking care of our states, taking care of of our communities, instead of just going all crazy about who's going to sit in Washington D.C. and take money from the people and distribute it the way they want to distribute it.
Right.
It's just
Yeah.
it's frustrating.
Okay. Well.
Okay, well, you're getting me riled up. We'll end there.
Yeah.
Happy 4th of July on this.
Yeah. Happy. Election day in Great Britain or United
Yeah,
Kingdom.
you vote for your uniparty. So
Yeah. Right. But yeah,
Okay.
we won't open that hole. We won't go down
of
that
worms.
rabbit hole right now.
right. Okay. All right. We'll end it here then. All right. Thanks a lot, Dad. Happy 4th.
Happy 4th.